I've just finished playing Dead Space 3 for the first time in more than a decade, and I can confidently say I will never ever cover it in any great detail, apart from now obviously. Let me explain why. I couldn't remember anything from my playthrough more than a decade ago, but even so, Dead Space 3's first few minutes filled me with little confidence. Remember Dead Space 2's amazing opening?
Listen, you're in terrible danger.
It's got a close-up of a bloke's face turning into Trifle, a brilliant chase sequence through a hospital, and some of the most well-crafted in-world tutorialization I've ever encountered. Well, Dead Space 3's consists of walking through the snow a bit until a very Uncharted-esque set-piece unfolds before you meet protagonist Isaac Clarke, and then bam! Gears of War. The game turns into Gears of War. If that isn't a statement of intent, I don't know what is, and it's one developer Visceral Games follows through on with gusto. If the original Dead Space is quiet, 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 bang, and Dead Space 2 is quiet, quiet, bang, bang, then Dead Space 3 is bang, 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 an endless, action-focused mess that lacks even a notion of the subtlety the series once possessed. Gone is most of the fantastic environmental storytelling, the expertly measured build-up to edge-of-your-seat set-pieces, and the well-paced storytelling, replaced with a constant assault on the senses so aggressive, it's the video game equivalent of having an aneurysm. During its early stages though, the game does flatter to deceive. Say what you want about Visceral blatantly ripping off Alien's theme for the music as you travel to different parts of a debris field, the rest of it is pretty great. Dead Space unfolded across a single ship, Dead Space 2 was set on a space station, and 3, at least early on, lets you mess around in space. It's a logical escalation in size and scope which makes sense, and it's combined with a setting which is visually stunning. You can't polish a turd, but you can cover it in glitter, and floating through space above Tau Volantis, the planet you eventually end up on, is absolutely Dead Space 3's glitter. There's smidgens of environmental storytelling, like when you explore the Admiral's quarters and find unitology books and the like scattered everywhere, and some of the side content is solid too. Avoiding the traps set by Tucker Edwards in Conning Tower is the best of the bunch, and exactly what missions like it should be. Short, interesting tales which help give the world colour outside the game's overarching narrative.
It took me a while, but I realize now why we couldn't be allowed to live. So if you found this and you're still alive, I guess I can finally do my part. Computer, blow all remaining charges. It's time for you to join us.
In many ways, Dead Space 3's first few hours are precisely what you'd want from the third game in a trilogy. The problem is that once you leave the debris field for Tau Volantis, the icy expanse you'll spend the rest of the game stuck on, everything goes downhill extraordinarily quickly. Visceral serves up a plate of, not filet mignon, but at least a decent sirloin to begin with, but then suddenly whisks it away, replacing it with a bowl of particularly viscous gruel. I use the word viscous intentionally too, because that's what a lot of Dead Space 3 feels like. Everything is laid on too thick. Anyone who wanted a weapon crafting system and universal ammo added to the series after 2 is a deviant, and I'm sorry if that's some of you watching, but you are deviants. It doesn't add anything, in fact it actively detracts from what was previously a well-balanced system. Every weapon in the original and 2 were viable, your only worry was making sure you had enough bullets or similar, whereas in 3 the necromorphs are faster and stronger, which means only the most ridiculous damage-dealing superguns are worth putting any effort into. Apparently, EA practically forced Visceral to include co-op late in Dead Space 3's development, and it shows, as necromorphs are far tougher to accommodate it. If you're playing with a friend, I'd imagine that's no problem, but if you're Billy No Mate, like me, it means most encounters during the game's back half especially become endless wars of attrition against bullet-sponge enemies. Collecting resources yourself and using scavenger bots to do the dirty work for you to power up your weapons becomes essential, because endless resource gathering is another thing the series desperately needed. if you're a crazy person. That idea of co-op making everything a bit wonky extends to Dead Space 3's story too. If you're familiar with it, you'll no doubt remember this touching scene involving Carver, your sidekick, where he wonders if his efforts have at least gone some way towards redeeming him for his past actions.
I alienated my son, wrecked my family. Isaac, I killed Santos. Is that what a good man does?
Good men mean well.
Except all of it comes almost completely out of the blue in single player. Isaac barely interacts with Carver at all, with him mostly just loitering around in the background during cinematics where he actually appears, and so him suddenly speaking about his inner turmoil comes off as incredibly strange. It would be like me randomly opening up about my catastrophic erectile dysfunction during a video. You'd wonder why I thought that was an appropriate thing to chat about when we don't even know each other that well. If you're playing co-op and can actually access the side content you're not allowed to experience if you're playing alone because screw you, then great, good for you, you might appreciate Carver all the more, but otherwise he's nothing more than an angry dude who just huffs around for 15 hours straight. And speaking of story issues, the love triangle you have to suffer through whether you're playing single player or co-op is excruciating. Isaac and a dude named Norton constantly squabble over the affection of 2's heroine Ellie, whose character is completely assassinated. She was previously a badass who lost an eye to Nolan Stross but soldiered on and saved Isaac from certain death, but in 3 she's turned into an absurdly titted damsel in distress, present only so 2 male characters can squabble over her for hours on end.
Good to see you made it, Isaac. Maybe we should give you two some time alone, huh?
What the hell does that mean?
It means for someone who's in the past, you're awfully glad to see him.
We need him. This mission needs
Come on,
him.
we need him or you need him?
You got something to say to me, Captain?
Stop. Just stop.
From the wonderfully heroic to the stupendously chesty, the lack of care paid to the spectacularly wabbed Ellie is really, really disappointing. It doesn't help that Norton is a dreadful addition too, although thankfully his story does have a happy ending. Good riddance to bad rubbish. Side content also takes a massive turn for the worse during Dead Space 3's second half as well. Towards the beginning of the game, you will come across the odd gem during your forays off the beaten path, like that featuring Edwards mentioned earlier, but the further you progress, the more you'll notice that most of them are basically exactly the same. I am not kidding either, this isn't a case of them being a bit samey. If you're striving to complete as much of the optional content as possible, you will find yourself exploring the same boring sets of industrial corridors over and over again ad nauseam. It is so disrespectful of players' time to be making them suffer through the same thing multiple times for no good reason. Honestly, I cannot stress enough how disrespectful it is of players' time to make them suffer through the same thing multiple times for no good reason. What makes it all such a shame is that along with 3's genuinely intriguing early hours set on the debris field and the occasional interesting side story, there is evidence that Visceral were trying to do new things. It's just that unfortunately a lot of them are half-baked. The freezing mechanic introduced when you first crash land on Tau Volantis, for example, could have been used to great effect here and there, but just as quickly as it's added, it's taken away, never to appear again. The feeders you stumble upon and can choose to creep past are something different too. Particularly with their macabre backstory, their creation is the result of starving humans having no choice but to chow down on necromorph meat. Even Visceral's choice to set the last few chapters inside a set of alien ruins wouldn't necessarily have been a bad one if they weren't so unremarkable. Sure, they look visually distinct, but they're also exceptionally repetitive, and when so much of the game leading up to them is already a massive slog, their inclusion isn't a welcome one. To me, the major problem is that rather than take the delicious slice of terrifying toast that was Dead Space 2 and spread a layer of delicious new idea jam on top to create Dead Space 3, it feels more like Visceral picked up the jar of jam, threw it at the nearest wall, and then left us, the players, to lick up the mess. The game is a sticky jumble of new ideas that usually don't quite work as well as they should, combined with old characters, gameplay concepts and mechanics that either haven't really evolved or have become actively less appealing. Is Dead Space 3 a bad game? No, I don't think it's a bad game per se, and I think there's plenty who will enjoy it, but as an entry in the Dead Space series, I personally think it's pretty atrocious. And of course, how can we forget about Dead Space 3's finale? Once you finish trekking through alien ruins, which again are about as appealing as the hemorrhoid I've been struggling with since last Tuesday, you're treated to this abomination of an ending. The irrationally boobed Ellie mourns Isaac's apparent death before you're given a glimmer of hope as the credits finish rolling.
Ellie? Ellie?
It's a bad ending which becomes pretty repulsive when you consider what happened soon after the game released back in 2013. I'm sure a lot of you watching will remember, and yes, it's still just as egregious today as it ever was. EA sold Dead Space 3's actual ending separately. If you were a complete mug, like I was, twice, and eventually succumbed to EA's incredibly transparent shakedown, a far better finale is offered up at the end of downloadable content Awakened.
Lunar Flight Control, this is CMS Terra Nova. Does anyone read us out here?
That, however, is what Dead Space 3's ending should have been from the start, but instead, EA took us all for a bunch of James Blunt, charging $10 or £8 for a 1-hour experience leading up to a conclusion which should have been an inclusion from the very beginning. It was an absolutely diabolical decision, and an extraordinarily irritating one at that. There is nothing more unsatisfying than a jarring ending that lacks a worthwhile resolution, and honestly, anyone creating any kind of content which does that deserves to be